YouTube is one of the best places to have a podcast, and there's a reason for that: discoverability. Discoverability is why YouTube is so popular, because it basically allows you to put your stuff out there and people can actually find it. It isn't a huge surprise that this is true because YouTube is owned by Google. And so Google essentially owns both the #1 and the #2 search engines in the world. But one of the biggest issues with podcasting is that it's really hard for people to find your podcast. It's really more about word of mouth than it is about surfacing information that somebody happens to be looking for at the right time. So if somebody sits down and they Google something, most of the time podcasts are not something that's going to be coming up. That is all about to change. And the reason that it's all about to change is because Apple Podcasts is about to start transcribing every single podcast out there. Up until now, if you wanted to transcribe your podcast, you had to pay a service or you had to hire somebody in order to listen to the podcast and type everything out. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, one of the reasons is because you want to do this is for SEO, search engine optimization. Because if you have a transcription in your podcast, well, then when somebody goes searching for a piece of information and you talked about it on your show, your podcast has a chance to come up in search results. And that is incredibly powerful for growing your podcast audience. Even though I've known all this for years, I've never actually gotten a transcript for my podcast because A, it's pretty expensive, and B, I don't have a website to point people to. But now Apple is going to be transcribing every podcast on their service, and Apple is huge in podcasting. I can't think of any shows that would not be on Apple Podcasts. It's massive in the industry. In fact, if we look at the stats of my podcast, 1/3 of my listeners listen on the official iOS podcast app. That other third is Spotify, and then the final third is all of the other apps put together. But that is just for the RSS feed of my podcast. If you look at the numbers of my podcast on YouTube, YouTube is the #1 source for where people consume my show. So already YouTube has this huge leg up when it comes to discoverability, at least for my show. But now the audio show is going to be able to get all of that same SEO, search engine optimization goodness that I'm getting on YouTube. And theoretically, I won't actually have to do any more work in order for that to happen. One question that I have about this is, will it be possible for search engines like Google to basically crawl through the transcript of my podcast that is auto-generated by Apple and then use that to surface my show when somebody does a search? My initial thought is that Apple wouldn't allow this to happen. And the reason that I thought that is Apple likes to control everything. They want to be in charge of the entire scene from step 1 to step 38, you know? But the more that I thought about this, the more I came to the conclusion that this could push people back towards Apple Podcast as an app. You see, in recent years, Apple Podcast has definitely diminished in terms of user base. If you go back just a few years, my podcast audience would have been 50% on Apple Podcasts and 50% on everything else. Now that Spotify is getting into the game of podcasting and they are growing really quickly, Apple has to respond to them. So if Apple is doing all of this transcription and then they make it available for search, I feel like search engines like Google are going to be able to crawl that transcription, surface the podcast when somebody does a search. This might lead to people listening to Apple Podcasts more. And even if it doesn't, what I think is going to be a possibility is once a transcript for your show has been posted, maybe you'll be able to download that transcript from Apple's podcasting website and then use that transcript in an updated version of your podcasting file. So basically, for instance, I upload my podcast. My audience that always listens to my stuff listens to it. After a little bit of processing, because it doesn't happen instantaneously, Apple transcribes the podcast. I download that, I update the file, and add the transcript to my RSS feed, and now there's more information out there, suddenly increasing the search visibility or viability of my show. I think that this could be absolutely huge for podcasting and for my show in general, so I'm really excited about that. But what would be even better is if I posted the transcript to my website with my podcast right there. That way, when people are searching for a topic that I have covered, it doesn't just show a podcast, but it also takes them to my website. And then I can have links to all the different ways that you can get my show: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Pocket Cast, wherever. And people can just pick what works best for them. But I still think that YouTube is the place that you want to make sure that you have your podcast existing, even if you don't have it anywhere else. Even if you don't have an audio show, you want to have your podcast on YouTube. And if you have a YouTube channel, I think you should have a podcast on that YouTube channel, because podcasting, it's a fantastic way to grow your channel, just like YouTube is a really good way to grow your podcast. But let's talk about why podcasting is a good way to grow your YouTube channel. YouTube values watch time above everything else. They want people to watch YouTube for as long as possible. That way they can show more ads. Now let's think about the average view duration of a typical 10-minute YouTube video. Maybe people are going to get through 30, maybe 40% of a 10-minute video, and if that happens, YouTube will probably recommend your video. If your video has 50% retention, then you are doing unbelievably well. But when it comes to podcasting, the average view duration, or the average amount of people that finish a full episode of a podcast, is 60%. That's like double the average view duration of a typical 10-minute YouTube video. And podcasts are way, way longer. For some reason, people who turn on a podcast, they're far more likely to listen to the whole thing than people who are looking for something on YouTube. And this is incredibly powerful for growing your YouTube channel, because putting out a podcast, you are attracting people to your channel who are generally going to be in it for the long haul. They want to put on a show and listen to it or watch it while they're doing other stuff. This leads to a massive increase in watch time, and that means YouTube has an opportunity to serve way more ads on your show than they otherwise would be able to. And because of this, and because you are getting so much more watch time, it's much easier for you to hit those monetization statistics that everybody's aiming for. It's much easier for you to build a relationship with that audience, and it's much easier to grow your channel. Speaking of building relationships, podcasting is really well known for building that sense of trust between the listener or the viewer and the people who are on the show, far more than YouTube does. I'm sure that there's some kind of psychology behind it, but there's a reason why people engage with podcasts so much. And it's easier to build relationships with those in your, I'm not going to use the word audience here. Instead, I want to use the word community instead, because it's a much more powerful thing to build than building an audience. A community, they all feel like they're in it together with you. An audience, they're just people watching something. Most podcasting apps, most podcasting hosts, most podcasting services, none of them offer a good way to communicate back and forth between the podcaster and the community that listens to your show. YouTube has built-in comments. Now, a lot of times those comments are going to be a cesspool of the worst people on the internet, but as long as you are really good about kicking out people who are causing problems, you can have fantastic conversations in the YouTube comments. And because of this, because you get more interaction with your community, you know more about what they want, and you can then make shows that will appeal to them more, leading to even more watch time. So while this change from Apple, I think, is absolutely going to increase discoverability of your show outside of YouTube, I still think that you want to make sure that your podcast is on YouTube because nobody is as good at discovery as YouTube is. So, all right, you've decided that you want to put your show on YouTube. Next up, you want to decide what do you have to do to take your podcast to the next level? Well, check out this video right here. Thanks for watching.